She had no name, no voice, no one to claim her. And for 48 years, she waited in the sand, patient as the tide for someone to remember she had ever existed at all. I'm going to tell you a story tonight that will haunt you. Not because it's filled with monsters or supernatural terrors, but because it's true, every single word of it. And because somewhere out there, someone knew exactly who she was. Someone kept that secret for nearly half a century while she lay forgotten in a shallow grave, her identity stolen, her story silenced. But here's the thing about secrets buried in sand. Eventually the wind shifts. Eventually the truth rises. And when it does, it doesn't just whisper, it screams. Before I take you deeper into this mystery, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever looked at a stranger and wondered about their story, if you've ever felt that pull of curiosity about the lives that intersect with ours and then vanish like smoke, then you need to share this video. Someone watching might hold a piece of this puzzle. Someone might remember something they'd long forgotten. Subscribe to this channel because this story doesn't end here tonight. It ends with justice. It ends with a name finally spoken aloud after decades of silence. And you deserve to be here when that moment comes. Now let me take you back to a summer day in 1974, when America was still reeling from Watergate, when the Vietnam War was grinding toward its bitter end, and when a 12-year-old girl named Tammy would stumble upon something that would change the course of her entire life. The Cape Cod National Seashore stretches along the outer arm of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, a place where the Atlantic Ocean meets land with both violence and tenderness. The dunes there are ancient things, sculpted by wind and time, covered in beach grass that whispers secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. In the summer months, tourists flood the area, drawn by the promise of pristine beaches and that particular quality of light that painters have tried to capture for centuries. But in the quieter corners, in the places where the dunes fold into hidden valleys called blowouts, secrets can hide for a very long time. July 26, 1974, started like any other summer day for young Tammy. She was exploring the Race Point area with her family, her bare feet leaving prints in the sand that the wind would erase within hours. The dunes there create a landscape that feels almost alien. Rolling hills of sand that block the view of the ocean, creating pockets of isolation mere feet from the busy beach. Tammy had wandered into one of these natural amphitheaters, curious about what might be hiding just over the next ridge. What she found there would remain with her for the rest of her life. At first, her mind tried to make sense of it, tried to transform the horror into something acceptable. A mannequin, maybe. Someone's discarded store display, left here as a prank. But mannequins don't attract flies. Mannequins don't have that particular stillness that belongs only to the dead. Mannequins don't have hands placed so deliberately, so peacefully, as if in prayer. She was lying on her stomach, the woman in the sand. A beach blanket covered part of her body, green with a distinctive pattern that investigators would later photograph from every angle. Her head rested on her folded hands, a pose so serene that it seemed almost staged, like someone had arranged her with care. But there was nothing serene about what had been done to her. Her skull had been nearly severed from her body. Someone had crushed it with tremendous force, then removed her hands. The severing of the hands was meticulous, deliberate, not the work of nature or animals, but of someone who wanted to ensure she could never be identified through fingerprints. Tammy's scream brought her family running. Within hours, the quiet dunes of Race Point had been transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape flapping in the ocean breeze, officers trudging through sand that yielded no footprints. No evidence, nothing but the body of a woman who seemed to have materialized from nowhere. I've spent months reconstructing what happened next, interviewing people who were there, reading through boxes of case files that were never meant to see the light of day. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about this case, about justice, about how we decide which victims deserve our attention and which ones we allow to fade into footnotes. The initial investigation was hampered from the start. The sand preserved nothing. The summer heat had accelerated decomposition, and the woman's killer had been thorough. No identification, no purse, no jewelry, beyond a single pair of earrings. The only physical evidence was her body, the beach blanket, and a pair of Wrangler jeans that had been neatly folded and placed beside her. Size unknown, because the tags had been deliberately removed. Detective Lieutenant George Killen took charge of the case. He was a meticulous man, the kind of investigator who believed that every victim had a story worth uncovering, that every life taken demanded an answer. He couldn't have known then that this case would consume him for years, would follow him into retirement, would become the great, unfinished symphony of his career. The medical examiner's report painted a grim portrait. The victim was female, somewhere between 25 and 40 years old. The range was frustratingly wide. She stood approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, with an athletic build that suggested someone who took care of her body. Her hair was auburn, possibly red, and it had been styled in what investigators would later describe as a professional manner. But here's the detail that would prove crucial decades later. Her teeth. She'd had extensive dental work done, expensive work, the kind that suggested either wealth or access to good insurance. Several teeth had been extracted, and she wore a partial denture. Someone had invested significant money in this woman's smile. Someone had cared about her appearance. Someone somewhere had loved her enough to ensure she could face the world with confidence. And yet, when she vanished, no one came looking. No missing person report matched her description. No frantic family members showed up at the police station with photographs clutched in trembling hands. How does a woman simply cease to exist? How does someone with such carefully maintained teeth, such deliberately styled hair, such obvious connections to a life of some means, simply disappear without anyone noticing? These were the questions that kept Detective Killen awake at night. These were the questions that would echo through the decades, unanswered. The investigators tried everything available to them in 1974. They distributed composite sketches to newspapers and television stations across the country. They contacted dental associations hoping someone might recognize the distinctive work. They reached out to missing persons databases, such as they were in that era, and came up empty. The woman in the dunes remained nameless. As summer turned to autumn and autumn surrendered to the harsh Cape Cod winter, the case went cold. But it didn't die. Cases like this never truly die. They simply wait, patient as the tide, for the moment when the world is ready to hear their story. I think about Tammy sometimes, that 12-year-old girl who stumbled into a nightmare while looking for shells or sea glass. She's in her 60s now, a grandmother, a woman who has lived an entire life in the shadow of what she witnessed that day. In interviews, she's spoken about how the image never leaves her, how she can still close her eyes and see that woman lying in the sand, hands folded in that terrible peace. Some experiences mark us in ways we can never escape. Some truths, once seen, can never be unseen. But here's what I keep coming back to, what keeps me awake at night as I piece this story together. Somewhere out there, in 1974, someone knew exactly what had happened. Someone had committed this act of violence and then walked away, had returned to their normal life, had perhaps sat down to dinner with their family that very evening while a woman lay cooling in a sandy grave just miles away. And that person kept their secret for years, for decades. They watched as technology advanced, as DNA databases expanded, as cold case units grew more sophisticated, and still they said nothing until the sand finally gave up its secrets. Chapter 2. The Years of Silence. The years after 1974 passed like waves against the shore, relentless, rhythmic, and ultimately transformative. The Lady of the Dunes, as she came to be known, entered a strange kind of purgatory. She existed in police files growing dusty in basement storage rooms. She lived in the memories of a handful of investigators who couldn't let her go. She haunted the dunes themselves, her spirit seemingly woven into the very landscape that had become her final resting place. I've traced the path of this investigation through the years, following the paper trail like breadcrumbs through a dark forest. What I found was not a story of neglect, but of frustration, of genuine effort meeting insurmountable obstacles, of a time before the tools we now take for granted. DNA databases, facial reconstruction technology, social media's ability to spread information to millions in minutes. Detective Killen retired in 1987, but he never stopped working the case. I spoke with his family, with colleagues who remembered him poring over the same photographs year after year, looking for something he might have missed. He had a theory, one he kept returning to throughout his life, about who the Lady of the Dunes might have been. But theories without evidence are just stories we tell ourselves, and the evidence he needed remained frustratingly out of reach. The 1980s brought new interest in the case, briefly. A journalist named Ben Harrison became fascinated by the mystery and wrote a series of articles that caught national attention. For a few weeks, tips poured into the police station. Sightings, suspicions, the names of women who had vanished around the same time. Each lead was followed, each lead died. I remember reading Harrison's notes, preserved by his family after his death. He'd written something that struck me with its simplicity. She had a life, she had a name, she had people who knew her face, who recognized her laugh, who could describe the way she walked into a room, and yet she's become a ghost. Not because no one knew her, but because no one is talking. That observation would prove prophetic in ways Harrison could never have imagined. The physical evidence, meanwhile, was beginning its own slow journey through time. In 1980, the Provincetown authorities made a decision that would prove crucial. They exhumed the Lady of the Dunes and performed a second, more thorough autopsy. Medical technology had advanced in the 6 years since her death, and investigators hoped that fresh eyes might reveal something previously missed. What they found was disturbing. The initial assessment of her injuries had been incomplete. The damage to her skull was even more severe than first reported, suggesting a level of violence that spoke to rage, to personal hatred, to something far beyond a random killing. And there was something else, something the medical examiner noted with careful precision, evidence suggesting she might have been several months pregnant at the time of her death. Think about that for a moment. Let it settle into your bones the way it settled into mine when I first read that report. She wasn't just a woman who was killed. She might have been a mother-to-be, carrying a life that would never see the light of day. The violence done to her wasn't just murder. It might have been something far darker, far more personal. But even this revelation led nowhere. Without identification, without a suspect, without any way to confirm or deny the pregnancy finding, it simply became another detail in a file that was growing thicker but no closer to resolution. The 1990s brought the first serious attempt at forensic reconstruction. A specialist created a bust of the Lady of the Dunes, working from skull measurements and tissue depth markers to recreate her face in 3 dimensions. The result was striking. A woman with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that seemed to look directly at you, asking the question that had gone unanswered for 20 years. Do you know me? The bust was featured in television programs and magazines and newspapers across the country. For the first time, people could see her as she might have appeared in life, not as a victim, but as a person. And yet still no one came forward, no one recognized that face, no one spoke. I find myself returning again and again to this paradox at the heart of the case. Someone knew her, someone loved her, someone somewhere had photographs of her, had memories of sharing meals with her, had perhaps argued with her or laughed with her or cried on her shoulder. People don't simply materialize from nothing. Lives leave traces, connections, evidence of their passing. And yet, for this woman, those traces seem to have been erased as thoroughly as her fingerprints had been removed. The theories multiplied as the years passed. Some investigators believed she was a victim of the burgeoning drug trade, killed and disposed of as a warning or simply because she knew too much. Others thought she might have been a sex worker, someone living on the margins whose disappearance wouldn't raise alarms. Still others developed more elaborate theories involving organized crime, secret affairs, and elaborate cover-ups. Each theory had its adherents. Each theory had its holes. The turn of the millennium brought new hope in the form of DNA technology. By 2000, investigators had preserved enough biological material to create a genetic profile of the Lady of the Dunes. This profile was entered into national databases, compared against missing persons records, tested against the genetic material of families who believed they might be searching for a lost relative. The results were disappointing. No matches, no connections. The DNA sat in a database, waiting for a comparison that never came. I want to pause here to ask you something. Consider your own life for a moment. Think about all the people who know you, family, friends, colleagues, acquaintances. Think about all the records that document your existence. Birth certificates, driver's licenses, medical records, social media profiles. Now imagine all of that erased. Imagine vanishing so completely that even your own family doesn't report you missing. What would that require? What circumstances would have to exist for you to simply disappear? That's the question that haunts this case, not who killed her, though that question is important, but how she came to be so utterly alone in the first place. The 2010s brought another wave of attention. A new generation of investigators had taken over the case. People who hadn't been born when the Lady of the Dunes was discovered, but who felt the weight of her story nonetheless. They brought fresh perspectives and new technologies. Isotope analysis of her teeth and bones revealed that she had likely spent her childhood in the northeastern United States, probably within a few hundred miles of where she was found. Genetic genealogy, the revolutionary technique that had solved the Golden State Killer case, was applied to her DNA. Progress was being made, slowly but surely. The circle was closing. The net was tightening around a truth that had remained hidden for nearly 50 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you how this story ends, and I promise you, it does end with justice, with a name finally spoken aloud, I need to tell you about the theory, the one that would prove both partially right and spectacularly wrong, the one that would lead investigators down a rabbit hole of Hollywood connections, criminal conspiracy, and a director whose name you would definitely recognize. Because in 2015, a researcher made a connection that would explode across the internet, generate headlines around the world, and ultimately prove that sometimes the most compelling theory is not the correct one. Chapter 3. The Hollywood Connection. The year was 2015, and a woman named Joe Hill, yes, that Joe Hill, the best-selling author and son of Stephen King, was doing what many true crime enthusiasts do, scrolling through Wikipedia, falling down rabbit holes of unsolved mysteries, looking for stories that grabbed him by the throat and wouldn't let go. What he found would ignite a firestorm of speculation that burned for years. Hill noticed something the previous investigators had apparently missed, or had dismissed as coincidence. In 1975, just 1 year after The Lady of the Dunes was discovered, the legendary film director Steven Spielberg had filmed Jaws on Martha's Vineyard, just a short ferry ride from Provincetown. During filming, Spielberg had used numerous local extras, many of them hired from the Cape Cod area, and in one particular scene, the famous 4th of July beach sequence, Hill believed he spotted something extraordinary. A woman, an extra, with auburn hair and a distinctive profile that bore a striking resemblance to the forensic reconstruction of the Lady of the Dunes. The theory spread like wildfire. What if the Lady of the Dunes had been a movie extra? What if she had been killed sometime after filming wrapped in October 1974? What if her connection to the movie production explained why no one had reported her missing? Transient workers, drifting from job to job, were often invisible to the systems designed to track people. I'll admit, when I first encountered this theory, I was captivated. The symmetry was almost too perfect. A woman found dead in the dunes, appearing as a ghost in one of the most popular films ever made. Her face preserved on celluloid for millions to see while her real identity remained unknown. It was the kind of story that felt like it should be true, the kind of twist that would make a Hollywood screenwriter proud. Investigators took the theory seriously. They obtained the original film footage and subjected it to enhancement. They contacted surviving members of the production crew, asking about female extras with auburn hair. They created side-by-side comparisons of the forensic reconstruction and the woman glimpsed in the film. The results were inconclusive. The woman in the film could have been the Lady of the Dunes. She could also have been any one of hundreds of local women who spent a summer day being paid to pretend to panic at an invisible shark. The resolution wasn't good enough. The angle wasn't right. It was another tantalizing lead that ultimately led to another dead end. But the Jaws theory did something important. It brought the case back into public consciousness. A new generation discovered the mystery. Amateur sleuths began poring over the evidence with fresh eyes. And somewhere, in the shadows, someone who knew the truth felt the walls beginning to close in. I spent weeks researching the Jaws connection, interviewing people who had been involved with the production, reading through archives of local newspapers from that summer. What I found wasn't evidence of the Lady of the Dunes' involvement with the film. What I found was evidence of how desperately the public wanted this mystery solved, how hungry we are for closure, for answers, for the satisfaction of seeing justice done. The theory ultimately proved to be a red herring, a dramatic one certainly, but a red herring nonetheless. The real answer, when it finally came, would have nothing to do with Hollywood. It would involve something far more mundane, far more tragic, and far more human. But we're not there yet. We're still in the darkness, still searching for the light. The investigation continued through the late 2010s with renewed vigor. Genetic genealogy had become increasingly sophisticated, allowing researchers to trace family connections through commercially available DNA databases. The Lady of the Dunes genetic profile was being compared against millions of samples, looking for the distant cousin or half-sibling who might provide the key to her identity. Meanwhile, other researchers were pursuing different approaches. Some analyzed the beach blanket found with her body, tracing its distinctive pattern to a manufacturer, then to retail outlets, then to sales records from 1973 and 1974. The blanket had been sold primarily in the New England area, which confirmed what investigators already suspected, but narrowing down purchases to a specific buyer proved impossible. Others focused on the dental work. The Lady of the Dunes had received significant dental care, including extractions and a partial denture. In the 1970s, dental records weren't standardized or easily searchable. But perhaps, researchers reasoned, if they could find the dentist who had performed the work, they might be able to identify the patient. This approach led to some promising leads. Several dentists in the greater Boston area were identified who had performed similar work in the early 1970s. Their patient records, those that still existed after decades of storage, moves, and the natural attrition of paper records, were painstakingly examined. But the Lady of the Dunes' dental records weren't among them. It was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. Every time investigators thought they had grasped something solid, it slipped through their fingers. I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough in cold case investigations: the psychological toll on the investigators themselves. I've spoken with several people who worked this case over the years, and they all describe a similar experience. A sense of personal failure, of having let the victim down, of being haunted by a face that demanded answers they couldn't provide. One retired detective told me something I'll never forget. He said, "She becomes part of you after a while. You start thinking about her when you're supposed to be thinking about other things. You see her face in crowds. You hear about a woman with red hair and your heart speeds up, thinking maybe, just maybe, this is the connection you've been looking for. It's not healthy probably, but she deserves someone to carry that burden. she deserves someone to remember. That's what it means to be the Lady of the Dunes. Not just to be a victim, not just to be a case file, but to be carried in the hearts and minds of strangers who have dedicated years of their lives to speaking her name, whatever that name might be. The year 2020 arrived, bringing with it a pandemic that shut down much of the world, cold case investigations which rely heavily on in-person interviews and access to physical archives, slowed to a crawl. It seemed like the Lady of the Dunes might wait even longer for her identity to be restored. But science doesn't stop, even when the world does. In laboratories across the country, the work of genetic genealogy continued. Algorithms churned through databases, looking for the connections that had eluded human investigators for decades. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the pieces began to fall into place. I'm going to ask you to pause here and think about something. In your life, have you ever encountered a mystery that you simply couldn't let go of? Something that lodged itself in your mind and refused to leave, no matter how much time passed? If so, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. What is it about certain mysteries that capture our imagination so completely? What makes us invest ourselves so deeply in the lives and deaths of strangers? Leave a comment and let me know, because I think the answer to that question might tell us something important about who we are as human beings. It might explain why a case like this, which by all rights should have faded into obscurity decades ago, continues to draw thousands of people into its orbit, all of them searching for the same thing: truth. Chapter 4. The Breakthrough. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early 2022. I remember because Tuesdays had always been unremarkable days in my life. The day after Monday's fresh start, the day before Wednesday's midweek milestone. Nothing important ever happened on a Tuesday, until it did. A source within law enforcement reached out to me with news that would make my hands shake as I listened. After 48 years, the FBI and the Provincetown Police Department were about to make an announcement. The Lady of the Dunes had a name. I should tell you how they got there. I should tell you about the painstaking work that made this moment possible. Because the breakthrough didn't come from a dramatic confession or a lucky break. It came from science, from persistence, from the accumulated weight of 48 years of refusal to give up. Genetic genealogy had advanced dramatically in the years since investigators first entered the lady's DNA into databases. The technique, known as investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG, works by comparing DNA from an unknown sample against DNA that people have voluntarily submitted to commercial testing services. When a match is found, even a distant one, genealogists can begin building family trees, working backward and forward through generations until they identify potential candidates for the unknown person. In the Lady of the Dunes case, the initial DNA comparisons had yielded frustratingly distant matches. Fourth cousins, fifth cousins, people related so distantly that building a complete family tree seemed almost impossible. But as more and more people submitted their DNA to commercial databases, the matches grew closer. Third cousins appeared, then second cousins. Then finally, the breakthrough that investigators had been waiting for. A genealogist, I'm not able to name her here, but she knows who she is and she deserves recognition for her work, spent months building family trees from these matches. She traced bloodlines back through generations, identified common ancestors, and then worked forward again to find descendants who might fit the lady's demographic profile. A woman between 25 and 40 years old who would have been in the Cape Cod area in 1974. The search narrowed. Candidates were identified. Family members were contacted, asked to provide DNA samples for comparison. And then, in early 2022, the final match was confirmed. The Lady of the Dunes was Ruth Marie Terry. As I speak her name for the first time in this telling, I feel the weight of it on my tongue. Ruth Marie Terry, a woman who was born, who lived, who loved and was loved, who walked through the world with hopes and fears and dreams, who was killed and buried and forgotten. Ruth Marie Terry, not the Lady of the Dunes. Ruth. Let me tell you who she was. Ruth Marie Terry was born in 1936 in Tennessee, one of several children in a working-class family. Her early life was marked by the struggles common to her generation and her circumstances, the lingering effects of the Great Depression, the disruptions of World War II, the limited opportunities available to women of her era. But Ruth was a survivor. She had a spark about her, a determination to make something of her life, despite the obstacles in her way. She moved north as a young woman, eventually settling in the Boston area, where she found work and built a life for herself. In the years leading up to her death, Ruth had been married. Her husband was a man whose name I will share with you shortly, a man whose identity would prove as shocking as Ruth's own. She had lived in several locations around New England, never quite settling down, always seeming to move on before roots could take hold. Her family, those who remained, had lost touch with her in the early 1970s. This wasn't unusual for the era. Before social media, before cell phones, before the thousand small connections that now bind us together, people could and did drift apart. Families fractured, relationships faded. And when Ruth stopped writing, stopped calling, stopped appearing at holidays and family gatherings, her relatives assumed she had simply moved on, started over somewhere else, chosen to leave her past behind. They couldn't have known, they couldn't have imagined. I've spoken with members of Ruth's family since her identification. They've asked me not to share the details of those conversations, and I'm honoring that request. But I can tell you that the emotions were what you might expect. Grief, certainly, for a life lost. Relief that the mystery was finally over. And something else, something harder to name, a kind of guilt, perhaps, for having let her disappear without searching harder, without demanding answers, without refusing to accept her silence as simply the way things were. But here's what I want you to understand. Ruth's family is not responsible for what happened to her. The person responsible for Ruth's death is the person who crushed her skull, who severed her hands, who buried her in a sandy grave and walked away. That person bore the guilt for 48 years, and justice, though delayed, was about to find them. Because investigators didn't just identify Ruth, they identified her husband. His name was Guy Muldavin. Chapter 5. The husband, Guy Muldavin, died in 2002, taking whatever secrets he carried to his grave. But the investigation into his life revealed a pattern of behavior that painted a damning portrait of the man Ruth Marie Terry had married. Muldavin was what modern criminologists might call a chameleon. He moved through life under multiple identities, using different names in different contexts, leaving behind a trail of failed relationships, suspicious circumstances, and unanswered questions. He was charming, by all accounts. The kind of man who could convince you of almost anything if he set his mind to it. He was also, it became increasingly clear, dangerous. His marriage to Ruth was his fourth. Let that sink in for a moment. By the time he met Ruth, Muldavin had already married and divorced 3 women. Investigators began tracing what had happened to those women, and what they found was disturbing. The first wife survived. So did the second. But the third, a woman whose name has been kept confidential at her family's request, had disappeared under circumstances that had never been fully explained. At the time, her disappearance was attributed to abandonment. She had simply walked away from her life, her family assumed, started over somewhere else. Sound familiar? The pattern was unmistakable. Muldavin had a history of marrying women who then vanished. He had a history of moving frequently, of using false names, of avoiding the kind of stable community ties that might lead to questions when his wives stopped appearing in public. I want to be clear here. At the time of this recording, Guy Muldavin has not been officially charged with Ruth Marie Terry's murder. He cannot be charged. He's been dead for 2 decades. But the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. He had the means, the opportunity, and, based on his history, the apparent pattern of behavior that suggests Ruth was not his only victim. Investigators are still working to determine if other unsolved cases might be connected to Muldavin. The work is painstaking, requiring them to track a man who seemed determined to leave no traces, who built his life on deception and erasure. But the work continues, because Ruth deserves the full truth of what happened to her, and so do any other women who might have crossed paths with this man. I spent weeks investigating Muldavin's life, trying to understand who he was and how he became what he was. What I found was a man who seemed to lack the basic human capacity for genuine connection. He used people, women especially, as resources to be exploited and then discarded when they were no longer useful. He constructed elaborate facades, presenting himself as successful, trustworthy, desirable, while underneath lay something cold and calculating. The psychological profile is one that will be familiar to anyone who has studied predators. Narcissism, manipulation, an absence of remorse, a willingness to do whatever was necessary to serve his own interests. Ruth, with her resilience and her determination to make a better life, must have seemed like the perfect target. Independent enough to be isolated from family support systems, vulnerable enough to be controlled, trusting enough to believe the lies he told her. And when she became inconvenient, when she discovered something she wasn't supposed to know, or when she tried to leave, or when whatever trigger set him off was finally pulled, he did what he had apparently done before. He eliminated the problem. He erased her identity. He buried her where she wouldn't be found. Except she was found. And 48 years later, science caught up with what he had done. I find myself thinking about the concept of delayed justice. Is it meaningful to identify a killer who can never be punished? Is it worth the resources, the effort, the emotional investment required to solve a case that can never go to trial? I believe it is. Not because punishment is the only purpose of justice, but because truth has value in itself. Ruth Marie Terry deserved to have her name spoken. Her family deserved to know what happened to her, and the record of history deserved to be corrected, to reflect the reality of who she was and what was done to her. Moreover, identifying Muldavin as her likely killer serves a purpose beyond this single case. It alerts investigators to examine other unsolved cases that might be connected to him. It provides closure, imperfect, incomplete, but real, to people who have spent decades wondering what happened to women who loved and trusted this man. And it sends a message, however belated, that some crimes are simply too important to be allowed to fade into obscurity. The investigation into Muldavin's other possible victims continues as I record this. I've committed to updating you as new information becomes available. If you want to be here when those updates come, if you want to see justice continue to unfold, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. This story isn't over. It's just entering a new chapter. Chapter 6, The Victim's Voice. I want to do something different in this chapter. I want to step away from the facts of the case, from the timeline and the evidence and the investigation, and try to do something that feels almost impossible. I want to give Ruth Marie Terry her voice back. We know so little about who she actually was, and the details of her life before her death are sketchy, pieced together from fragmentary records and the fading memories of family members who lost touch with her decades ago. But every person is more than the sum of their official documents. Every life contains multitudes that can never be fully captured by vital records and police reports. So let me tell you what I've learned about Ruth, not as a victim, but as a person. She loved music. This comes from a cousin who remembered her from family gatherings in the 1950s. Ruth was always the one who would get the song started, who would remember all the words when everyone else was fumbling, who would dance even when there was no dance floor. She had a voice, this cousin said. Not trained, not professional, but strong and clear and full of something that made you want to listen. She was funny. Multiple family members mentioned this, the way she could make a joke land, the way she could find humor in difficult situations. It was a survival skill, probably, developed in childhood as a way of coping with circumstances beyond her control. But it was also a gift, something she shared freely with the people around her. She believed in second chances. This might have been her greatest strength and her greatest vulnerability. Ruth was the kind of person who believed that people could change, that past mistakes didn't have to define future possibilities, that everyone deserved the opportunity to start over. It was probably this quality that led her to trust Guy Muldavin, to believe whatever lies he told her about who he was and what he wanted. She wanted children. A family member shared this detail with me, and it's the one that stays with me most strongly. Ruth had always talked about having children someday, about building the kind of stable, loving family she had perhaps never had herself. The medical examiner's finding that she might have been pregnant at the time of her death takes on additional weight in this context. She might have been close to realizing her dream when it was taken from her. I don't know what Ruth was doing on Cape Cod in the summer of 1974. I don't know if she was there on vacation, or if she had moved there permanently, or if she was just passing through on her way to somewhere else. I don't know what her final days were like, whether she was happy or frightened or hopeful or resigned. These are gaps in the record that may never be filled. But I know she deserved better than what she got. She deserved to live out the decades she was denied. She deserved to sing more songs, tell more jokes, give more second chances to people who perhaps deserved them more than Guy Muldavin did. She deserved to have children if she wanted them, to grow old, to see the world change and change again. She deserved to be remembered as Ruth Marie Terry, not as the Lady of the Dunes. I want to speak directly to Ruth now, as absurd as that might seem. As someone who has spent months immersed in her story, who has carried her image in my mind through long nights of research and writing, I feel I owe her that much. Ruth, I don't know if there's any part of you that can hear this. I don't know if consciousness persists beyond death, if the people we've lost are still somehow aware of what happens in the world they left behind. But just in case you can hear me, I want you to know you are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten again. Your name has been spoken aloud. Your story has been told. The man who did this to you has been exposed, even if he escaped human justice by dying before he could face it. And the people who have carried your case all these years, the investigators, the researchers, the amateur sleuths who refused to let you fade away, they did it because they believed you mattered. You mattered, Ruth. You still matter. Chapter 7, The Investigator's Legacy. I need to tell you about the people who made this resolution possible. Not just the scientists who processed the DNA, not just the genealogists who built the family trees, but the investigators who kept this case alive for 48 years when it would have been so easy to let it go. Detective Lieutenant George Killen, who led the initial investigation, died in 2006 without seeing the case solved. But his meticulous documentation, his careful preservation of evidence, his refusal to let Ruth become just another cold case, these things made the eventual identification possible. If he had been less thorough, less dedicated, less convinced that this victim deserved answers, the physical evidence might have been lost or degraded beyond use. His successors carried on his legacy. Each new generation of investigators inherited not just the case files, but the sense of responsibility that Killen had established. They understood that they weren't just working a case, they were holding a trust, keeping faith with a woman who had no one else to speak for her. The Provincetown Police Department deserves special recognition. They're a small department, without the resources of larger agencies, operating in a community that sees its population swell during tourist season and shrink during the quiet winters. They could have handed this case off to federal authorities and washed their hands of it. Instead, they kept it close, kept it active, kept pushing for answers, even when those answers seemed impossibly far away. The FBI's help was crucial in the final stages of the investigation. Their resources, their expertise in genetic genealogy, their ability to coordinate efforts across multiple jurisdictions, all of these things contributed to Ruth's identification. But it was the partnership between federal and local authorities that made the breakthrough possible. Neither could have done it alone. I want to talk about one investigator in particular, though I won't use his name because he's asked to remain out of the spotlight. He was assigned to the case in 2015, a young detective who had grown up hearing about the Lady of the Dunes, who had always wondered who she was and what had happened to her. When he got the chance to work the case himself, he threw himself into it with a passion that some of his colleagues found excessive. He spent his own money on research materials. He worked weekends and holidays without overtime pay. He drove hundreds of miles to conduct interviews that might, or might not, lead somewhere useful. He became, in a very real sense, Ruth's champion within the department, the person who wouldn't let her case be deprioritized, who fought for resources and attention when other demands pressed in. When Ruth's identity was finally confirmed, this detective wept. He told me about it later, somewhat embarrassed by the intensity of his reaction. But I don't think he needs to be embarrassed. I think that kind of emotional investment is exactly what cases like this require. I think the dead need advocates who care about them as people, not just as files to be processed. The amateur researchers also deserve recognition. The true crime community has sometimes been criticized, fairly in some cases, for sensationalizing tragedies and treating victims as entertainment. But in the Lady of the Dunes case, amateur researchers made genuine contributions. They digitized records, cross-referenced databases, spotted connections that professional investigators had missed. They kept public interest alive during the long decades when it would have been easy to forget. One researcher in particular spent years building a comprehensive website dedicated to the case, collecting every available photograph, every newspaper article, every theory and lead and dead end. That website became a resource for professional investigators, a centralized repository of everything known about Ruth Marie Terry before anyone knew her name. When I asked this researcher why she had invested so much time and effort, she gave me an answer I'll never forget. Because she was real. Because she was someone's daughter. Maybe someone's mother. Because she deserved to be treated like a person, not like a puzzle. That's the legacy of this investigation. Not just the identification of Ruth Marie Terry. Not just the exposure of Guy Muldavin, but the demonstration that persistence matters. That caring matters. That even the coldest cases can be warmed by human dedication and eventually brought to resolution. Chapter 8. The Science of Justice. I want to take a moment to explain the science that made Ruth's identification possible, because I think it represents something genuinely revolutionary in the pursuit of justice. If you understand how genetic genealogy works, you'll understand why cases that seemed unsolvable just a decade ago are now being cracked open at an unprecedented rate. Every cell in your body contains DNA, the genetic code that makes you who you are. That DNA is unique to you. No one else in the world, unless you have an identical twin, shares your exact genetic sequence. But here's the important part. You share portions of your DNA with your biological relatives. Your parents each contributed half of your genetic material. Your siblings share, on average, about 50% of their DNA with you. The percentage decreases as you move further out on the family tree. First cousins share about 12.5%, second cousins about 3%, and so on. Commercial DNA testing services like Ancestry and 23andMe work by analyzing your DNA and comparing it against their database of other users. When they find people who share segments of DNA with you, they can estimate how closely related you are based on the percentage and pattern of shared genetic material. Investigative genetic genealogy takes this process and applies it to unknown samples. In Ruth's case, investigators had preserved enough biological material from her body to extract and analyze her DNA. That DNA profile was compared against commercial databases, looking for matches. The initial matches were distant, people related to Ruth by 4, 5, even 6 generations. But those distant matches provided starting points. Genealogists could identify the common ancestors shared by Ruth and her distant relatives, then build family trees forward through time, mapping every branch and twig until they identified descendants who might be Ruth herself. This is painstaking work. Each family tree can contain hundreds or thousands of individuals. Records must be checked, birth certificates verified, death certificates confirmed. Mistakes can send researchers down wrong paths that waste months of effort. But when the work is done correctly, it can identify unknown victims with near certainty. The technique was pioneered in criminal cases, most famously in the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018. Joseph James DeAngelo had evaded capture for decades, but his DNA left at crime scenes was eventually matched to distant relatives in a genealogy database, leading to his identification and arrest. Since then, the technique has been applied to hundreds of cases, both identifying unknown victims and catching previously unknown perpetrators. The implications are staggering. There are approximately 10,000 unidentified human remains in the United States alone. Many of them have been waiting for decades, like Ruth, for someone to speak their names. Genetic genealogy has the potential to identify a significant percentage of these individuals, giving closure to families who have been waiting for answers and potentially solving crimes that had seemed permanently unsolvable. But the technology also raises ethical questions that we as a society are still working through. When you submit your DNA to a commercial testing service, you're not just providing information about yourself. You're providing information about every person you're biologically related to. Your distant cousin might not have consented to have their genetic information used in a criminal investigation, but your decision to take a DNA test made that possible. There's also the question of genetic privacy more broadly. DNA contains information about health conditions, predispositions, ancestry, and other sensitive details. When that information is entered into a database, it can potentially be accessed for purposes the original donor never anticipated or approved. I don't have easy answers to these questions. I think the value of identifying victims like Ruth and catching predators like the Golden State Killer is immense. But I also think we need robust discussions about consent, privacy, and the boundaries of acceptable use for genetic information. What I do know is that without genetic genealogy, Ruth Marie Terry might still be the Lady of the Dunes, nameless and forgotten in a sandy grave. The science gave her back her identity, it gave her family closure, and it exposed the man who almost certainly killed her. That feels like justice to me, even if the path to that justice raised complicated questions along the way. Chapter 9. The reckoning Guy Muldavin died in 2002 in California, far from the Cape Cod dunes, where he had buried his wife nearly 3 decades earlier. He lived those 30 years as a free man, never charged with any crime related to Ruth's death, never publicly suspected of having harmed anyone. Think about that for a moment. 30 years of freedom. 30 years of waking up each morning knowing what he had done and going to sleep each night without consequence. 30 years during which Ruth lay in a marked grave. She had been buried in a cemetery after her body was found, given a headstone that read, Lady of the Dunes, because no one knew what else to call her, while her killer lived his life as if nothing had happened. I struggle with this. I struggle with the injustice of it, the cosmic unfairness of a predator escaping human judgment simply by living long enough. There's a part of me that wishes Muldavin had lived to see his crimes exposed, had been forced to face the evidence against him, had spent his final years in a prison cell rather than whatever comfort his California existence provided. But another part of me finds some solace in the idea that truth has its own weight, its own consequences, its own form of justice. Muldavin's name is now permanently linked to Ruth's murder. Every future mention of him, every record of his life, will carry the taint of what he did. His descendants, if he has any, will have to reckon with the knowledge that their ancestor was a killer. Whatever legacy he might have hoped to leave behind has been replaced by the legacy of his crimes. Is that enough? Is it justice? I don't know. But it's something. And something, after 48 years of nothing, feels like progress. The investigation into Muldavin's other possible victims continues. Investigators are methodically reviewing every relationship he had, every move he made, every woman who passed through his life and then disappeared. The work is slow, hampered by the passage of time and the deaths of potential witnesses. But it continues, because Ruth may not have been his only victim, and those other women, if they exist, deserve the same resolution she received. I've spoken with family members of some of Muldavin's former associates, people who knew him in the years after Ruth's death. Their memories paint a consistent picture. A man who was charming on the surface, but somehow off underneath. Several people used the word cold to describe him. Others mentioned a temper that could flare without warning, a capacity for cruelty that he usually kept hidden, but that occasionally showed through. One woman, who had been friends with one of Muldavin's later girlfriends, told me about a conversation she'd had in the late 1980s. The girlfriend had confided that she was frightened of Muldavin, that he had threatened her during an argument, that she was planning to leave him. A few weeks later, the girlfriend moved away suddenly without saying goodbye. She had assumed, this woman told me, that the girlfriend had simply gotten out while she could. But now she wonders if something else happened. Investigators are looking into it. They're looking into everything. The exposure of Muldavin's crimes has also triggered a broader conversation about how we, as a society, respond to missing persons cases. Ruth's family lost touch with her in the early 1970s and assumed she had simply moved on. But what if they had reported her missing? What if they had demanded answers? Would she have been found sooner? Would her killer have been caught? These are painful questions, and I want to be clear that I'm not blaming Ruth's family. The 1970s were a different time. Communication was harder. Families drifted apart. And the systems designed to track missing persons were primitive compared to what we have today. Her family did what people did in that era. They assumed she was living her own life somewhere else, and they respected what they believed to be her choice to disconnect. But the lesson for us today is clear. When someone disappears, ask questions. Demand answers. Don't assume that silence means everything is okay. The world is full of predators like Muldavin, people who count on family members and friends to accept implausible explanations, to avoid uncomfortable confrontations, to let missing persons remain missing. If you know someone who has disappeared, don't let them become another Lady of the Dunes. Make noise. File reports. Refuse to accept non-answers. It might be the difference between a cold case that stays cold for decades and a resolution that comes while there's still time for justice. Chapter 10. Ruth's Victory. I want to end this story where it should always have ended, with Ruth Marie Terry restored to her rightful place in history, her name spoken aloud, her killer exposed, her memory honored. In November 2022, a ceremony was held at the Provincetown Cemetery where Ruth had been buried for nearly half a century. Family members attended, some of them meeting for the first time, drawn together by the tragedy they shared. Investigators who had worked the case were there, including that young detective I mentioned earlier, the one who had thrown himself into the investigation with such passion. Members of the press attended, documenting the moment for posterity. The headstone that had read Lady of the Dunes was replaced with a new one. This one bore her real name, Ruth Marie Terry, the dates of her birth and death, and a simple inscription, "Now you have a name." I wasn't there. I watched the coverage later, like millions of others. But I'm told the ceremony was both somber and celebratory. There were tears, of course. There were memories shared and questions left unanswered. But there was also something that felt like victory. Ruth had been found. Ruth had been named. Ruth would never be forgotten again. The resolution of this case has given hope to people working on other cold cases. If the Lady of the Dunes could be identified after 48 years, using only the biological evidence preserved from her body and the tireless work of investigators who refused to give up, then perhaps other victims can be identified too. Perhaps other killers can be exposed. Perhaps other families can receive the closure they've been waiting for. Genetic genealogy continues to advance. Databases continue to grow. Techniques continue to improve. The toolkit available to investigators today would have seemed like science fiction to the detectives who first processed Ruth's crime scene in 1974. And the toolkit available 10 years from now will likely seem equally miraculous to us. The work continues. The search for justice continues. And Ruth Marie Terry's story has become part of that larger narrative. A reminder that no victim is ever truly forgotten. That time and technology are on the side of truth. That the sand eventually gives up its secrets. I think about Ruth often now that this project is finished. I think about the woman who loved music and could make people laugh, who believed in second chances and dreamed of having children. I think about what her life might have been if she had never met Guy Muldavin, if she had been luckier in love, if she had lived to see the 21st century and all its wonders. She would be in her 80s now if she had lived. She might have grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren. She might be sitting on a porch somewhere, watching the sunset, thinking about all the years she'd been given and all the people she'd loved. Instead, she lies in a Massachusetts cemetery under a headstone that finally bears her real name. But in another sense, she lives on in the memories of her family, in the records of this investigation, in the countless people around the world who have been touched by her story. The Lady of the Dunes is gone. Ruth Marie Terry remains. And that, I think, is the victory. Not the capture of a killer who escaped human judgment. Not the solving of a mystery that seemed unsolvable. But the simple, profound act of giving a woman back her name after nearly half a century of anonymity, of saying loudly and clearly and for all time, she mattered. She was real. She was someone. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you. Thank you for investing your time in Ruth's story. Thank you for caring about a woman you never met, who died before many of you were born, whose only connection to you is the shared humanity that makes us all worthy of being remembered. If this story has moved you, please share it. Share it because Ruth deserves to have her name known as widely as possible. Share it because there are other victims out there, still waiting to be identified, still waiting for someone to speak for them. Share it because stories like this matter. They remind us of what's possible when we refuse to give up, when we insist that every life has value, when we believe that truth, however long it takes, will eventually prevail. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. There are more stories to tell. Stories of victims who have been found, stories of victims still waiting to be found, stories of the investigators and researchers and family members who refuse to let the dead be forgotten. And if you're watching this and you know something about Ruth, about Guy Muldavin, about any cold case anywhere in the world, please speak up. Your information might be the key that unlocks a mystery. Your voice might be the one that finally brings closure to a grieving family. You have more power than you know. Ruth Marie Terry waited 48 years for justice. She received it not because of chance or luck, but because of people who cared enough to keep searching. Be one of those people. For Ruth, for all the others like her. For a world where every victim, no matter how long they've waited, eventually has their name spoken aloud and their story told. Her name was Ruth Marie Terry. Now you know her too,